Hello and welcome to the Safe Routes to School Asset Mapping webinar. This webinar is made possible with funding from the Michigan Department of Transit, the Michigan Fitness Foundation, and the Federal Highway Administration. I'm Colleen Sink, and I'm the Operations Coordinator at the Michigan Fitness Foundation Safe Routes to School program. The Michigan Fitness Foundation is a nonprofit organization based in Lansing, Michigan, and we've been involved with the Safe Routes to School program in Michigan since its inception in 2003. We administer the Safe Routes to School program on behalf of MDOT by providing training such as this and technical assistance to schools and communities participating in the Safe Routes to School program. So what we'll be covering today is asset mapping and how it's a different way to map community and projects and programs than a needs assessment approach. We'll discuss the value and types of different assets, as well as highlight the importance of looking at who is involved in the asset mapping conversation and process, as well as the actual steps to go through as you're asset mapping for a project. And then we'll do a practice exercise for asset mapping. So asset mapping is a positive approach to building strong communities by working with key stakeholders to identify existing strengths and potential assets available in a community to engage and then establish coordinated and accessible systems to be responsive to unique needs and issues that move the community to action. And it helps determine what those appropriate actions are to be taken. So there's some key differences between an asset approach versus a needs approach. And I'm very familiar with my background in public health, and some of you might be as well, with a needs approach. But also I think a needs approach sometimes is a little bit more intuitive to just humans generally. It's often easy to identify the negatives. So the asset approach is really trying to counter and flip the way that we're focusing on something. So with a needs approach, it's often a discussion of the problems, often surveying residents about issues, and the outcome is often a list of negatives. So it's often asking with a view of what is wrong and what needs improvement, and orients a group to focus on oftentimes outside assistance to come in to fix the problem. So it fosters more of a dependency of outside help to address these issues that are raised in this list of negatives that is created. So it can be slightly discouraging or even overwhelming to dive into when you do a needs approach at times. So the assets approach is trying to work to identify and discuss actually the capabilities of a local community. So by identifying what those local organizations, institutions, and assets are, as well as individual talents. As you're reviewing that, it helps you then think about the needs and how those assets can help fulfill those needs as you're identifying them. So it creates a list ideally for action to create impact in a community. It orients the conversation towards potential and the solutions at hand to solve the problems that are occurring. And it fosters a sense of independence, pride, and empowerment for a group to be change agents. It's really about discovering the connections among us and the strength within our network to focus on a mission together. Of course, that seems maybe a little idealized, and there's definitely some pitfalls as well to the asset approach to keep in mind so you can help avoid them. When you're using the asset mapping approach, sometimes it's easy to fall in an idea that there's areas that are asset needing and others that have assets. So trying to really think expansively about what is defined as an asset or could be an asset for your community. It also can sometimes get into a process of people ensuring or challenging people to not believe that others have inherent gifts. So really making sure that you're questioning your own thoughts about what is an inherent gift, what is knowledge, what everybody has their own existing knowledge from their experience. So how we can tap into those experiences, expertise, institutions, and resources throughout our community. So I think this slide is a little illustrative of that needs approach versus asset mapping approach. So the picture on the left of abandoned building, focusing on maybe a problem in a community area, and definitely one that we see in our Safe Routes to School programs. And then on the right, the image of some volunteers, this being an AmeriCorps team, doing a day of service to board up and clean up some abandoned houses and buildings along an identified route school in one neighborhood. There's four main values that I think are really important when we're thinking about asset mapping. And there's the long-term sustainable grassroots response to an issue. So by focusing on the positives, it can be really helpful to help motivate a group through the long term and to help build momentum by identifying the positives, sharing successes with each other and triumphs as you're moving along and you're returning to this asset mapping process, and really focusing on things that are within the group's control to build momentum on, really celebrating those small wins and improvements along the way. It also engages an entire community in responding to a wicked issue. So transportation being something that I think falls into a wicked issue category, so connected to culture, status, access, and many other things that contribute to our decisions about how we want to and how we can get around. So having a large group and engaging in solving a wicked issue is really important to be able to provide a nuanced and comprehensive approach. It also helps uncover current services, talents, and resources in the community. Once again, making sure that you're focusing on those pitfalls so that you're not inherently thinking only certain people have gifts. Even in our process, if you have a steering committee, making sure that you're expanding out and thinking about who else in your community has gifts beyond your main core team on your Safe Routes to School committee. Also, it helps to build linkages among stakeholders and organizations, and it helps to really showcase for a group how efforts of one portion or part of a group can be magnified by the other contributions and assets working in tandem. And it's really important with that to have alignment, and we'll discuss that a little bit further on in the presentation. In this approach, a lot of things are assets. I think in the language I've used already, it kind of focuses on people, but there's other kinds of assets. So starting off with things that actually aren't people. So physical assets, when we're thinking about our place and where we live, especially with Safe Routes to School, assets of land, places, building, transportation assets such as bicycles, facilities like gyms, community centers, or structures like pavilions can be really great for Safe Routes to School as places that you could identify as a remote drop site, and infrastructure along the way, such as parks as well, that could be used in a similar fashion. Then there's, of course, economic assets in your communities. So those that produce or are consumed in the communities, whether that's a formal business or informal economic assets in your area with bartering or training of skills and relationships. So the local economy can be really helpful. And I know that's really changing right now too. I think asset mapping right now is a really helpful skill as things are changing in our environment, but helping contribute those gifts as a part of Safe Routes to School sometime, or else also helping highlight our local economies within Safe Routes to School. We've had several businesses either contribute their parking lots sometimes to Safe Routes remote drop sites and things like that. So those areas can also be really important assets. You might also have a certain base of workers in your local economy that have a skill base that could be tapped into a Safe Routes to School team and process. So we have a community in East Lansing that's been working on Safe Routes to School, and they have really engaged a couple of professors and other individuals that have grant writing experience that work in the university at MSU. So tapping into that local economy for different skills and assets to your Safe Routes to School process. Then there's cultural assets. So arts, culture, language, traditions, story, local identity, histories, and customs are all fall into these assets. And this, I think, as a group of assets is one that's really overlooked, but it can be a really great way to engage people in Safe Routes to School. So one of our communities in Dearborn actually really tapped into cultural customs around traditional foods and sharings of food to really encourage people to attend action planning process and build trust within that community of parents to engage as stakeholders and to participate in their action planning process. I think it's a nuanced thing that doesn't get engaged enough, but can be really important for and really strengthen your planning process. Also events as cultural assets. So we've had a couple of communities tag in and connect Safe Routes to School activities with events like National Night Out and other community events like Open Streets and things like that to help promote Safe Routes to School. Further, stories, so the memory of a community and the potential of a community base. I think that collective memory and stories can be really important. So this we've seen in Safe Routes to School efforts when working with Detroit about the history of external choices being brought to that area and the level of distrust that the community felt, but it added a level of context to the overall conversation and helped drive the outreach process that was really undertaken in the long run to engage residents and center trust building in those opportunities that were being made. So Cultural assets are really important to think about. Then, of course, those human skills that I've touched on a couple ways, whether it's experiences, capabilities, human networks as an asset, passions or willingness to contribute time from residents. So those kinds of contributions are really important. And then, of course, local associations, whether it's a volunteer base, athletic clubs, faith-based organizations, other charitable groups, and cultural groups in your area. And then there's support from anchor institution and civic assets that can help round out a group. So actually, I'm going to highlight some of these with the pictures here. So the first one I'll start off is the one of the park map that's on the slide. So there's a small dot by that map. So the school there actually was using the trail system in the parks as an area or place for students to train bicycle learning skills along and through. So assets like that can be really useful for your community and for your Safe Routes to School program. As I mentioned, events like open streets, but also thinking about the events that Safe Routes to School already tries to put on with the Walk to School Day and Bike to School Day. So in the bottom right, there's a bike rodeo, tagging in that education into a Bike to School Day event to help promote Safe Routes to School and highlight the need for the programming and community support for that programming. And then there's anchor institutions as an example in the top here. There's a couple more kids, once again, on bicycles kind of in a circle. And this is actually a local bike shop that partnered with one of our nonprofit fiduciaries that does some Safe Routes to School work. And they came in as a local expert and partner with their educational base to help run these trainings. So a lot of different assets that can be thought of for Safe Routes to School in your community. So after we have this knowledge of what assets could be, it's also relevant to think about who's going to be a part of this conversation involved in the mapping. So it's relevant to think when you're building out your team and committee of who's going to be the stakeholders in that action planning process. So with asset mapping, this can be important because there's a real focus in the process to have it be driven by individuals within the community and those who are being served in the community first, as opposed to be driven by outside entities from the community, even if those outside entities are serving the community. So there's a focus a little bit, which we won't stay on too long, and it's maybe a little secondary, but it's good to invite that conversation of who is really driving the conversation, if it's really the community itself or outside entities. It's helpful in the conversation of asset mapping because your goal when you make it is usually set depending on a geographic area. So we'll be talking about that when we do the example of goal setting. Going counterclockwise here, starting in the top right, you're going to determine the purpose of your mapping is the first step to asset mapping. Then you're going to be working on identifying existing community strengths and moving to build relationships among those assets and plan and mobilize those assets. So we're going to break down each one of these. With determining the purpose of mapping, I've mentioned before, it's really helpful to have a specific population or geographic boundary. And this helps you define what you want to do, or rather where you want to do it with the geographic boundary when you're brainstorming and mapping assets and information that you're collecting and gathering. So after you've created that geographic focus, so that being the last part, you can see my cursor here, the focus of mapping. You're going to then want to think about if maybe there's already a good resource to inventory and database and think about asset towards this goal. You're also going to want to think about, is the goal itself creating an inventory, or can you use an inventory to help drive this goal? So do you want to develop a program or a database for future initiatives to put towards a goal? And you're also going to be wanting to think about how you can allocate when you do get to asset mapping. If there's scarce resources, how are you going to maybe allocate those for biggest impact? So as you're setting this goal, those are a few things you want to keep in mind. Is asset mapping itself the goal, or is there something beyond that driving it? So in this example, it's a little bit of asset mapping out the stakeholders, and then that call to action is really what we're trying to bring them to do. So this one's pointedly broader than Safe Routes to School with safety for active transportation, but it can be really useful to engage people in that conversation in Safe Routes to School specifically, or just to bolster around Safe Routes to School in your community with other assets and align people to that larger active transportation mission. Once you've created that goal with the focus of a practical boundary, whether it's a neighborhood, a school mapping zone, a zip code, census block, city, village, etc., you're going to take that goal and go back and think about existing skills and talents as mentioned. So thinking about the internal individuals once again, and the external, and how we can encourage and strengthen those internal strengths and potential we already have. So it's helpful, once again, if you already have a pre-existing inventory or list that you can draw from, and then maybe customize it based on the goal that you did set. So there might be already a list out there that you can just tweak for the goal that you have set. And you're going to want to think about, if you are using this inventory of the network partners or relationships that you've tapped into, you want to think about whether it's recent, which I think is really important currently because people's capacity is changing, their priorities are shifting. So think about if it's current, or touch base with those resources and those assets to make sure that they're up to date as to whether they can provide that capacity or asset to the group. I think also when you're identifying your existing strengths, we talk a lot about having a local Safe Routes to School coordinator and champion. It's really important for that champion to be able to check in with people on this accountability piece. So when you're identifying those strengths and you're doing that asset mapping, after you've asset mapped, so moving into the building relationships, you're going to want to have a coordinator that is helping make sure people are participating and taking those actions. So asset mapping your local coordinator can be important. And also it's important when you're doing this asset mapping to think about influential people to those stakeholders that you want to engage. Maybe they aren't engaged yet. And we're going to touch base on this a little bit further about how you can bring in those stakeholders. So engage those unengaged stakeholders with persuasive points and views about why this goal matters to them. So after you've identified the assets, you're going to want to build those relationships. And I think part of that is really empowering people to take action and making sure that we're showing up for each other. And part of that is keeping people informed, making sure that you're sharing out and they're sharing back as well, and sharing that knowledge together and mobilizing on each other's strengths. So utilizing multiple tools to help people stay engaged, which I know we're all adapting to as we're staying at home. So trying to use those tools that we do have and can use right now to keep people informed, keep people mobilized, and really help continue to identify the potential in each other, which is really encouraging and helps people continue want to show up and build upon those small wins to larger and larger actions. So it takes small things first to build trust to get to that big thing. So an example of this is the Safe Routes to School application even. Let's say you're a township and you're working with the County Road Commission and you haven't necessarily worked a lot together. So maybe you need to be showing up and building trust in small ways before you get to this larger application process together. So I think even just having those meetings and check-ins and really understanding what's important to them and vice versa is a really important way to get to that larger goal that you might have of working together on a $200,000 plus grant for Safe Routes to School. So making sure you're doing that relationship building amongst the assets. So ideally, once you're building these relationships, and this is kind of happening at the same time, is planning and encouraging action of those resources and keeping track of what's taking place. So having a collective place where you're sharing that information out. This is also where that local coordinator for Safe Routes to School comes in to track down and keep things moving, keeping people accountable, and making sure that information that's going out is consistent and that the group really takes ownership of it though. So it's not just one group, that those actions are spread out amongst the assets so that everybody feels mobilized and that they can really participate, not necessarily making sure you're not micromanaging. And I think this is really important when we get to volunteers, is making them understand why their contribution is important and making sure they feel empowered to do it, to mobilize and be part of it. So be that asset for the larger process. So now we're going to get a little bit into the exercise. So we're going to skip doing the goal. I think there's some details in the slides that you're going to get in the follow-up to this that helps you outline a goal. And there's many tools online with SMART objectives. It's kind of structured like a SMART objective. So we're going to provide a goal for the exercise, but generally you would come together with the group of stakeholders that you're working with and try and create a goal that everybody can agree upon and map out different assets. So in this spreadsheet, we have different layers of assets, some local assets, institutions, associations, and local gifts. And I know there's a couple categories of assets like physical assets that don't necessarily fit in any of these boxes, but it's helped to drive the conversation of assets generally. So we're going to work on this sheet here, but you're going to get a handout so you can do this yourself and create your own goal instead of the goal that we're going to give everybody. And then after you do the asset mapping, you're going to want to move into engagement. So especially when you've identified assets that haven't been engaged yet, you're then want to think strategically about how you can engage them in the process. And what are those persuasive points that can help them align to the mission of the goal that your group has set. For ease of today, I think it's also important, as I've mentioned, to think again about which assets are internal and which ones are external, so that you're thinking about the goal and who's within that boundary, who has control of the decision-making power in that boundary, and who is serving maybe the community, but in which the community doesn't have control. So all of those assets can be in the conversation, but making sure that you're really thinking about the balance of the community driving the force and having internal assets at the table in the conversation. That's just a plug for when you get to doing this exercise on your own. But right now, what we're going to do is going to just work on this goal of, in 12 months, we will mobilize 30 stakeholders to examine safety for active transportation within the community. We're going to break up into groups. We're just going to talk about the assets that you, and attending the webinar so far, about any assets that you think about in your community, and kind of have a group brainstorming, even though we're all from separate communities. And so also in the breakout areas, you can kind of share, hi, my name is Colleen, I'm from Safe Routes to School, and an asset in my community I was thinking about through this presentation is X, Y, Z. Add those things so you can get to know the other participants, and you should get an invite to go to those breakout rooms right now. Hopefully you had some time to start drawing out and adding things to this list here. This next point, which hopefully then if you do this by yourself or with your local group, is then thinking about some of the assets that were brought up that haven't been engaged yet, how you might try and engage those assets and align those unengaged assets with the goal that you set, which is all about being strategic in that first approach and trying to step in their shoes and see their values about why they would align to it. So the key example that I think about, and I think I used this already, so sorry if I did, maybe there's a business that you think would align with the goal that you've set, but they haven't engaged yet. So thinking of some persuasive points saying, you know, with Safe Routes to School, we're really interested in using your parking lot as a remote drop, or maybe you're trying to approach them to get some incentives for your program and some bigger things that, you know, we can't fund. Maybe you're trying to go to them to kind of get those incentives for your frequent walkers. So trying to get them to have a reason to engage. So, you know, we're going to help promote your program out to parents and families. If it's that remote drop site at a business, students and parents are going to be dropping off and picking up in the morning, and we'll see that you're supporting the safety of their students, the health of their students to get physically active. So hopefully that will drum up business, and, you know, depending on what the business is, you're going to have those people already there when you're open, coming and going. So you have people that are going to be right at top of mind. Oh, I think there's an example. There was actually a donut shop that Safe Routes to School program wanted to reach out to so they could use their parking lot. So you're going to have people right in the morning who doesn't want a donut before going to school. Maybe not the healthiest option, but so thinking about those persuasive points that you can kind of have ready before you approach them to try and bring them into the larger conversation of the goal that you're working on as a group. So if there's any stakeholders or things that came to mind in the conversations you had in the breakout rooms, if you want to share what that stakeholder is, and we can talk out some approaches to engaging them with having in mind why or how is the goal something that aligns with their goals. So having those talking points ready. This is the last slide I have for you. We're really thankful that you all joined us today and that you've been joining our other webinars, because it's great that hopefully we can count your community among hundreds of other ones across Michigan in supporting schools and the Safe Routes to School movement in Michigan. So it's a really big win, I think, for local communities in many ways, and it's a big win for MDOT with this program. If you have to reach me, here's my contact information. And then we have an evaluation for this session. We try and do these evaluations for each of our trainings. So if you wouldn't mind going to the link, so it'll direct you to a short Survey Monkey, and these surveys really help us make our trainings better in future subsequent years and to help other communities as well. So you could take a moment to do that, and thanks for joining us today.